This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 86, Case Update Special number 3. In this episode, I'll provide updates on some of the cases I've covered on previous episodes of the podcast, like I did in episodes 42 and 43 several months ago. It's been some time since those were released in December of 2020 and January of 2021, so I have plenty of updates to report. I plan to release several update episodes throughout the rest of the year, because there's no way they'll all fit into one episode. The cases discussed in today's episode include those of AJ Freund, Zymere Perkins, Raylee Browning, Alex Hurley, Logan Cline, Amari Boone, and Marion Jester-Montoya. Before I begin, I'd like to give shout-outs to my newest patrons, Tammy S. from Littleton, Colorado, Kelly M. from Haxton, Colorado, Dion M. from Ellenbrook, West Australia, Ashley M. from Grayford, Texas, Nicole H. from Prattville, Alabama, and from Jerusalem's Lot, thank you to Keoru K., Rebecca H., Shannon M., and Brandy C. Thank you all so much for your pledges and for helping me get even closer to my goal to continue doing this full time. I can't thank you enough. To support the show, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. With that, I'll jump right into the updates. If you've followed the podcast or sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com for any length of time, you're probably familiar with the story of 5-year-old AJ Freund, who was the first child I covered on both the blog and later the podcast, and whose story I've followed closely ever since. AJ was reported missing in April of 2019 by his parents, Drew Freund and Joanne Cunningham, who were arrested shortly afterward and soon led investigators a few miles from their home on Dole Avenue in Crystal Lake, Illinois, where police found AJ's little body buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in plastic garbage bags. As I've previously reported, AJ's mother, Joanne, pleaded guilty in December of 2019 to her middle son's murder. She had abused AJ both mentally and physically for years, but her final act of violence was a savage beating with a shower head while forcing AJ to take an ice-cold shower as punishment. He died hours later after his brain swelled to the point of herniation. At an incredibly revealing sentencing hearing on July 16th and 17th, 2020 that I covered in episode 22, Joanne was sentenced to 35 years in Illinois State Prison. In September of 2020, AJ's father, Drew, accepted a plea agreement of his own, pleading guilty to aggravated battery of a child, involuntary manslaughter, and concealment of a homicidal death in exchange for 30 years in prison. The update in AJ's case concerns 2 additional defendants criminally charged in relation to the 5-year-old's death, those being former employees of the Illinois Department of Child and Family Services, or DCFS. Carlos Acosta was the child protection specialist caseworker overseeing the extensive history of the Freund family, and Andrew Polovin was his supervisor. Both men were terminated from their DCFS positions in December of 2019 in the wake of AJ's death, and in September of 2020, based on their negligent handling of AJ's case, they received felony charges of endangering the life of a child and reckless conduct. Both were soon freed on bail. They have pleaded not guilty to the charges against them. In January of 2021, the Illinois Attorney General's office announced that certain statements made by the 2 men cannot be used in their criminal prosecution. Because of their positions, they could not decline to participate in the internal investigation into their handling of AJ's case. As a result, according to Assistant Attorney General Michelle Camp, their statements were coerced and therefore not voluntary, and as such, could not be used in their prosecution. The case against Acosta and Polovin has moved at a snail's pace. Court hearings have been repeatedly continued to later dates, and no trial date has yet been set for either defendant. The most recent status hearing on October 19, 2021, was continued until November 3rd at 9 a.m. Tracy Kotzman of the organization called Roar for AJ has attended every court date without fail, and I really want to give Tracy a huge shout-out for her dedication to AJ's case as the most ardent and vocal supporter of justice for the tiny, blonde 5-year-old boy whose story gripped countless people in McHenry County and all over the world. AJ would have turned 8 years old on October 14th. Just a side note, on all of my social media pages for all of the cases I've covered, I post a graphic and a write-up in honor of each child's birthday and the anniversary of their death. So if you're interested in seeing those, please make sure to follow the blog or the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest. These posts mean so much to me because it's my way of helping to keep these kids' memories alive and their faces and stories fresh in our minds. For everything they went through, they deserve at the very least to be remembered. Next up is another story near and dear to my heart, that of 6-year-old Zymere Perkins, who was murdered in September of 2016 in Harlem, New York. His mother's boyfriend, Raylee Smith, used a broken broomstick and a shower curtain rod to beat Zymere brutally before hanging him by his shirt from a hook on the bathroom door. I told Zymere's story in the 3rd episode of this podcast. Zymere's mother, Geraldine Perkins, waited several hours before taking Zymere to the hospital. While she waited, she cleaned the apartment where the family was squatting without electricity, read her Bible, put on some makeup and a wig, and finally tried to revive her son before carrying his lifeless body down to the street to catch a cab to the hospital. Zymere was pronounced dead on arrival. As I mentioned in my first update episode, Geraldine took a plea deal and was paroled in September of 2020. She has stayed under the radar since being released from prison. As for Raylee Smith, he was convicted in January of 2020 on charges of second-degree murder and first and second-degree manslaughter, as well as 2 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. Well, I have a glorious update for you on this one. On Monday, May 17, 2021, 47-year-old Raylee was sentenced to be incarcerated in a New York State prison facility for 25 years to life. Even if he gets out in 25 years, which is unlikely, Raylee at that point will be nearing 70 years old. Here's hoping he spends every second of the rest of his pathetic life behind bars. He's currently incarcerated in the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. On a personal note, earlier this year, I visited Zymere's grave for the first time in Rose Hill Cemetery in Linden, New Jersey, and was completely heartbroken to find that he had no headstone or marker of any kind. My mission from that moment forward was to get this sweet little boy a headstone, but despite my best efforts, I was unable to get in touch with the family member who owns the deed to Zymere's grave. I have not given up, and I won't. Although I haven't yet been able to orchestrate a plan to raise funds and have a headstone placed for Zymere, I couldn't let his grave remain unmarked, so I had a small memorial stone made, and on the 5th anniversary of Zymere's death on September 26, 2021, my 17-year-old son and I visited the cemetery and placed the little stone as well as a superhero flag customized with Zymere's name. The stone has an etching of Zymere's precious little face, and the inscription reads, "In loving memory of Zymere H. Perkins, June 21, 2010 to September 26, 2016. Our little superhero, Zai. You will forever be remembered." I've included a photo of the marker in the Facebook album I created for this episode. I'll keep you all posted on any progress I make on the headstone front. In episode 4, way back in March of 2020, I told you the heartbreaking story of 8-year-old Raylee Browning, who died on December 26, 2018. According to the medical examiner who performed Raylee's autopsy, she most likely died from a severe septic infection due to necrotizing bronchopneumonia with diffuse alveolar damage of uncertain etiology, which should have been obvious to her caregivers before she became ill to the point of death. Raylee was also covered in injuries including bruises, burns, lacerations, and a torn rectum. Raylee was also taking 7 prescription medications for mood disorders and severe autism, which it is strongly believed she did not suffer from and did not need to be medicated for. At the time of her death, Raylee was in the care of her father, Marty Browning, his wife, Julie Tichenelle Browning, and Julie's sister, Sherry Tichenelle, all of whom lived, along with Julie's 3 children, in a house in Hilltop, West Virginia. The 3 adults were finally charged a year after Raylee's death with death of a child by parent, guardian, or custodian, and child neglect causing death. They've all since posted bond and walked free from jail. The trial for Raylee's accused killers has been scheduled and rescheduled countless times since then. We're going on 3 years now since this sweet girl died at the hands of 3 people who should have protected her, and still, her loving family has no closure. Raylee's mom, Janice, tried for years to get custody of her daughter, who she called her sunshine, but Janice and Raylee were both catastrophically failed by Child Protective Services, law enforcement, and the family court system, as we've heard too many times in too many cases. Janice is holding on remarkably well with the support of her husband, Jeremy, and their blended family. I swear, by the time the trial is over, Janice will be well on her way to sainthood. She was fully prepared for the trial to take place this month, but yet again, it was continued, this time to January of 2022. Janice is expected to be called as a witness, and I imagine she will testify extensively about Raylee's fear of staying at her father's home, the abuse she disclosed to her mother, and the lengths to which Marty and the Tichenelle sisters went to prevent Janice from seeing Raylee, including moving without informing Janice or the court. In January of 2021, Janice and her attorney, Anthony Salvatore, filed a federal civil lawsuit against the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources, alleging the agency's Child Protective Services Division failed to protect Raylee despite complaints by teachers, Janice, and other witnesses that Raylee was being abused. The lawsuit also alleged that the agency falsified and withheld records to cover up its role in Raylee's death, stating, "The defendants willfully and recklessly falsified records to hide the abuse of RB. The defendants failed to take action to ensure that there was an adequate safety plan for RB in the home of Marty Browning and Julie Tichenelle, failed to ensure that Marty Browning and Julie Tichenelle were capable and competent to house children and to ensure the safety of all children, failed to ensure that the home was up to code and in compliance with WVD HHR policies and standards with respect to heating systems, electrical wiring, and other potential causes of fire in the home." Also, the lawsuit alleged WVD HHR altered records to conceal the failure to properly care for Raylee, changing and deleting information in Raylee's file in an attempt to correct their gross, reckless conduct. The suit contended that WVD HHR violated Raylee's constitutional rights under the 8th Amendment, which protects citizens against the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment. It's clear that Raylee was the victim of such treatment multiple times in the custody of her father and under the care of so-called Child Protective Services. Unfortunately, in early October of this year, a federal judge dismissed the civil suit, ruling that WVD HHR, as a state agency, is protected under sovereign immunity, a legal doctrine with a definition that just might make your head explode. Sovereign immunity means the government cannot be sued without the government's consent. Anyway, now that I assume you're all as furious as I am, the federal judge in question, United States District Court for the Southern District of West Virginia Chief Judge Thomas Johnston, dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice, which means that Janice can't sue the entire WVD HHR agency for Raylee's death, but she may in the future be able to sue Joe Sorrent, a CPS supervisor who was also named in the original suit. Sorrent retired on December 29, 2018, 3 days after Raylee's death, but is currently employed by WVD HHR as a temporary CPS worker. Government immunity, man. I don't even have the words, and you know that's a rarity. Someday soon, in whatever way possible, I just hope Janice sees the justice both she and her sunshine deserve. Since my last update episode, there's been plenty of movement in the case of 12-year-old James Alexander Hurley, better known as Alex, who died in his grandparents' home in West Yellowstone, Montana, in February of 2020. I told you Alex's story in episode 7 of the podcast. 5 individuals were charged in Alex's abuse, torture, and death: his grandmother, Patricia Batts, her husband, James Sasser Jr., the couple's 2 children, 18-year-old Madison Sasser and 14-year-old James Sasser III, and 18-year-old family friend, Gage Roush. As of the last update on the podcast in December of 2020, Alex's aunt, Madison, and uncle, James, had both accepted plea agreements, although Madison hadn't yet been sentenced. James III was sentenced last October to detention until he turns 18 and likely probation until he's 25. He is also required to participate in mental health treatment until he's 25. Not long after that episode was released, there was another update in the case. On December 29, 2020, Gage Rausch was sentenced as per the terms of a plea agreement he accepted the month before, pleading guilty to a single charge of assault on a minor. Gage was accused of participating in a single instance of abuse against Alex, hitting the much younger, smaller boy with a wooden paddle in an incident that was recorded on one of the family members' cell phones, as were a number of other incidents. I'm 1,000,000% positive the existence of so much video documentation of the abuse is the reason 4 out of 5 of these defendants have now pleaded out. In the incident in question, as Gage hit Alex with the object that has variously been described as a piece of wood, a paddle, and a bat, Alex cried and screamed, "I fucking hate this." Following Alex's statement, court documents revealed, Gage approached him, saying, "Yeah, you do. I know you do." Anyway, as part of the plea deal, prosecutors recommended Gage serve a 5-year suspended sentence, and on December 29th, Judge Peter Oman handed down the recommended sentence. Gage's attorney told the court her client took responsibility for his actions and was remorseful, and that a deferred sentence would allow Gage to prove he could be a productive, rule-following member of society. She said, "It was a tragic situation, and he really didn't know what he was getting into." A month after Gage's sentencing hearing, Madison Sasser accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to felony aggravated kidnapping in exchange for the dismissal of her charge of felony negligent homicide, which could have incurred up to 20 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. Because Madison was 17 at the time of the incident tied to the kidnapping charge, which I'll explain in a moment, she was to be tried as a juvenile and was therefore sentenced to youth probation with the Montana Department of Corrections until her 21st birthday. She will remain on probation until the age of 25. As part of the plea deal, she also agreed to testify against her parents at trial. The incident connected to the aggravated kidnapping charge to which Madison pleaded guilty occurred in December of 2019 when she was 17. A neighbor told police of witnessing Alex running away from the family's house as fast as he could, only to be caught and restrained by Patricia and Madison until James III was able to catch up. The neighbor said James III then dragged Alex back into the house, punching the 12-year-old repeatedly in the face, while Patricia and Madison followed behind, doing nothing to intervene. More than a few people have asked why the neighbor hasn't been charged as well, and I honestly don't have the answer to that question. Investigators in the case discovered that Madison had intimate knowledge of the systematic torture of Alex that took place in her family's home. She told police about a fight that erupted on February 1st, 2020, between her then 14-year-old brother and their 12-year-old nephew, during which James III kicked and punched Alex in the head and smashed the younger boy's head into a wall, denting the plaster. Alex's death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head. When I first learned of Alex's death, I felt very strongly that Madison should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, especially considering the message she allegedly sent her boyfriend, saying her nephew was like a piece of shit off my fucking shoe, who she wanted to go and die in the woods. Further text messages on Madison's phone revealed that she texted her boyfriend about Alex, "I'm so heartless to him, dude, honestly. I beat the shit out of him just now." Later, she added that she beat the shit out of him, my fucking hands hurt. With the passage of time and much consideration, my viewpoint has changed. I know this is the point where our opinions may diverge, and I can certainly respect other opinions in the matter, but I just want to explain why I'm not entirely furious over this young woman's sentence. As I've often said in the past, it's a scientific fact that the human brain doesn't finish developing until around the age of 25 to 27. It's also a scientific fact that children are shaped by the environment in which they spend their earliest years. Madison's brain developed within the home of her mother, who, based on the evidence in this case, exhibits clearly narcissistic and psychopathic tendencies. Those traits don't come from a void. I have no doubt Patricia exhibited such tendencies throughout her entire life, and therefore throughout the lives of her children. Being raised by such a mother undoubtedly affected her children's brain development. On top of that, the culture of abuse Patricia cultivated in that home, particularly when she took Alex in after her son Tommy's death, incontrovertibly affected the minds of her children, including Madison, James III, and little H.S., who was 6 years old at the time of Alex's death, and who can reportedly be seen in some of the evidence videos ignoring or even taking part in the abuse. Living in an abusive environment is incredibly stressful and traumatizing at any age, and it changes the way your brain works. It puts you into a constant state of fight or flight. You learn ways to survive and to lessen the abuse against yourself by going along with your abuser's whims. It's very common in cases of targeted child abuse for other children in the home to either ignore or even participate in the abuse of the scapegoated child in order to align themselves with their abuser and therefore reduce the chances that the abuser's ire will turn on them. Yes, Madison was a legal adult at the time of her arrest, but that doesn't mean she was mentally anywhere near maturity. According to her attorney, Elizabeth Montoya, Madison is immature for her age, adding that the young woman is racked with worry and constant stress and regrets what happened to her nephew. I wouldn't be shocked if Madison, James III, and even little HS are all diagnosed at some point with post-traumatic stress syndrome, as abuse survivors often are. Montoya said that Madison saw her parents physically abuse Alex and deprive him of love, attention, and basic needs. The attorney said the Sasser family environment was defined by chaos, manipulation, instability, violence, and trauma, describing a family that resorted to and normalized violence, torture, intimidation, and fear in their kids. She said Madison's home life was a war zone, adding, Alex was the enemy, and Madison's parents were the generals, and the other kids in the household were soldiers. Madison, Montoya said, was just a kid trying to please her parents by doing as she was instructed, even if she was told to do things she knew were wrong. Madison will live every day with the wounds that her family caused to her, her siblings, and ultimately and most severely to Alex. Prosecutor Bjorn Boyer said that Alex's mother, Alicia Davis, who attended Madison's sentencing hearing virtually, forgave Madison and asked him to request that Madison continue going to counseling and have no further contact with her parents. Mr. Boyer also said that although his sentencing recommendation recognized Madison played a part in Alex's death, it's something that I think she has shown remorse for. It's a significant role, but it also recognizes that this was mostly the parents. Even the role that her brother James had was mostly attributable to the parents. Madison's agreement to testify against her parents at trial is a huge win for the prosecution. She is old enough to remember a great deal about the environment and the culture of the household, and especially the events that took place in the house after Alex was taken in, which many believe Patricia orchestrated in order to obtain her son Tommy's death benefits. Madison's testimony against Patricia will undoubtedly be damning, and her participation may very well lock in a conviction against Patricia if her case does make it to trial. Patricia's trial is currently scheduled to take place in May of 2022, while her husband's trial was scheduled to begin on September 30th, 2021, and to last 10 days. However, at a brief plea change hearing on Friday, August 6, 2021, James Sasser Jr., who described himself as Alex's granddad, pleaded guilty to 3 felony charges: deliberate homicide, tampering with a witness, and criminal child endangerment. Through his attorney, Colin M. Stevens, James admitted under oath during the hearing that his grandson's death was the result of an aggravated assault by James III. James himself spoke few words during the hearing other than, "Yes, sir," "Yes," and "Yeah." Gallatin County District Court Judge John Brown asked James if he understood the gravity of admitting guilt, saying, "That's the strongest proof of your guilt known to the criminal law, sir." In the plea agreement, prosecutors Bjorn Boyer and Marty Lambert recommended James be sentenced to 100 years for the deliberate homicide charge, 10 years for the criminal child endangerment charge, and 10 years for the witness tampering charge, all of which would be served concurrently in Montana State Prison with none suspended. They agreed that James should be allowed to make his own sentencing recommendation at his full-day sentencing hearing, which is scheduled for 9 a.m. on Tuesday, November 9th, 2021. Due to James's guilty plea, all motions in the case have been dismissed except one that remains to be determined, which argues to allow contact between James Jr. and his son, James III. When James Sasser Jr. is sentenced, that will leave only one of the accused to go, Grandma Patricia Batts. The prosecution has previously stated it will seek the death penalty for old Trish. I'm very much against the death penalty for a variety of reasons, but I can't lie. I won't cry a single tear if that ends up being her fate. After following this case as closely as I have for a year and a half, I have zero sympathy or empathy left for the ringleader of the nightmarish Sasser family circus. The next case I'm glad to bring you an update on is the one I covered in episode 11, that of 11-year-old Logan Cline, who was found dead in the trunk of an abandoned car in Wichita Falls, Texas, on February 20th, 2020. While reporting a domestic incident between herself and her ultra-creepy, abusive sex offender boyfriend, Corey Trumbull, Logan's mom, Stormy Johnson, told Las Vegas police what happened to her son and where they would find his body. Subsequently, Stormy was arrested on a Texas fugitive warrant for tampering with evidence in connection with Logan's death. Her boyfriend, Corey, was charged in Nevada with misdemeanor domestic battery, as well as 4 felony charges for his assault on Stormy: first-degree kidnapping, domestic battery with a deadly weapon resulting in significant bodily harm, domestic battery by strangulation, and coercion constituting domestic violence using threat or physical force. Corey was charged in Texas with capital murder and tampering with evidence in Logan's death, which is thought to have been caused in December of 2019 by blunt force trauma to the head, although the results of his autopsy have not been released publicly. While in custody, in March of 2020, Corey and Stormy were also charged in Nevada with possession of visual pornography of a person under 16, 3 counts of sexual assault against a child under 16, 2 counts of lewd acts committed by a person over 18 with a child of 14 or 15, and child abuse or neglect. Without getting into detail, I will simply add that at the time Logan's remains were found, Corey and Stormy were living out of their truck in Las Vegas, along with Stormy's 15-year-old daughter and several dogs. For his sex charges, Corey was sentenced to 2 to 10 years in the Nevada Department of Corrections. For the domestic violence incident, he received another sentence of 2 to 10 years to run concurrently with the other sentence. He may be eligible for parole as early as March of 2022, but parole will absolutely not mean freedom for him, because at that point, he'll have to face the music for his capital murder charge in Texas. When Stormy pleaded guilty to felony child abuse, her sex abuse charges were dismissed, and she received a sentence in Nevada of 12 to 30 months in prison. Well, on August 13, 2021, Stormy was released from Nevada's Florence McClure Women's Correctional Facility directly into the custody of police from Wichita Falls, Texas. She was booked into the Wichita County Jail, not just on the evidence tampering charge she received in 2020, but also a brand new charge of murder. I believe the new charge stems from forensic interviews conducted with Logan's then 15-year-old sister, who I'll call LC. These are new details we didn't have previously, and they're beyond horrific. The girl told a detective that while they lived with Corey in a motel room in Wichita Falls, Logan was abused repeatedly and brutally. She said Corey beat and abused Logan every day for no reason, using, among other things, his hands, his feet, a club, and a knife. Often, LC told the detective, her mother joined in on the beatings. More than once, Logan's nose was broken. He was also cut, and his body was bruised from head to toe, although he was never taken for medical treatment. LC said Logan was forced to sleep in a closet, and both she and her brother were sexually abused by Corey and their mother. Logan's sexual abuse, she said, involved bestiality on several occasions. About 2 weeks before Logan died, LC said, Corey stomped on her brother's head. After that, Logan no longer acted like himself, and he was no longer able to speak clearly. On the night of Logan's death, LC said, Corey and Stormy beat Logan relentlessly and repeatedly with a belt, a stick, and their hands. She said, they just kept hurting him. Logan began having seizures. The couple tried feeding him soup, but he coughed up blood and soon became unresponsive. When he was unable to find a pulse, Corey attempted CPR, but before long, he told Stormy and her daughter that Logan was gone. Corey put Logan's body into the bathtub, which Stormy filled with cold water. Then they both put ice on him. His body stayed in the bathtub until they moved it, ostensibly to hide it in the abandoned car, after which they skipped town and headed for Vegas. The Times Record News reported that on December 14, 2019, a Wichita Falls police officer performed a welfare check on LC and Logan at the Red Roof Inn, speaking with both children. Stormy did not attempt to report any type of abuse to the officer, who later reported that a dog crate in the room contained 2 dogs. On December 28, 2019, the family was evicted from the hotel room for non-payment. 2 police officers stood by while Corey, Stormy, and LC were evicted. Logan was not present, and Stormy did not attempt to report her son's abuse or death. I swear, just when I think Logan's story couldn't get any more awful and tragic, it always seems like more details like those come out and prove me wrong. This story is one of the most gut-wrenching I've ever covered, and my heart hurts for Logan, for his sister, for his dad, and for everyone who loved him. Just last week, on October 21st, Wichita County Criminal District Attorney John R. Gillespie filed the state's announcement of ready with the court, giving notice that his office is prepared to proceed to trial and requesting that Stormy's case be placed on the next available docket and therefore be set for trial in the appropriate manner. Stormy is represented by court-appointed attorney Dustin Nims. She's scheduled for a pretrial conference on January 14, 2022. Next, I'll provide an update on the story of 3-year-old Amari Boone, whose case I covered in episode 12. Amari died at Cook Children's Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas on Easter Sunday of 2020. At the time, he was in the care of foster fathers Deondrick Foley and Joseph M. Delancey. Despite constant hounding of the Fort Worth Police Department and the Tarrant County District Attorney by multiple parties, no arrests were made for months, and frustrations were extremely high. On January 22, 2021, both men were arrested and booked into the Tarrant County Jail. Although the specific charges against the men were unclear, I reached out to the Tarrant County Courthouse on January 28 and was told Joseph Delancey faced 3 counts of injury to a child by omission with serious bodily injury, while Deon Foley faced 7 counts of injury to a child with bodily injury. To put that into perspective, Amari's death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head. He suffered a fractured skull, bleeding on the brain, several broken ribs, multiple broken fingers, 2 broken arms, and a fractured pelvis. Prior to their son's death, his biological parents, Rodney Boone and Ariana George, discovered injuries on their son during visitation. They took photos of the injuries and sent them to their CPS caseworker. Amari's injuries were evaluated at Cook Children's and found to be concerning, but Amari and his baby brother were not removed from their foster home, and Amari died less than a month later. Without a doubt, Amari was murdered, yet his foster parents were charged with simply injury to a child. No murder, no manslaughter, not even abuse resulting in death. Both men bonded out of jail within 5 days of their arrests. Needless to say, many people were furious with this development, and we weren't quiet about it. In the days following these paltry charges and the men's release from jail, volunteers from Light for the Missing, which administers the Facebook groups entitled Justice for Amari Boone and Fight for Justice for Amari Boone, ramped up efforts to raise public awareness of the utter injustice of Amari's case. Besides contacting the jail itself, the Tarrant County Courthouse, and multiple news outlets, we also promoted and participated in a coordinated social media blast, during which we repeatedly shared a link to a video one of our volunteers made about Amari's case, along with the hashtags Amari's Life Mattered and Justice for Amari Boone, in an attempt to get either or both topics trending. In late January, I spoke with Amari's father, Rodney, and featured our conversation that week in Minisode number 2, Amari's Life Mattered, which you can find between episodes 47 and 48, wherever you listen to this podcast. After Deon and Joseph were charged, news stations obtained court documents that revealed previously unpublished details about the circumstances surrounding Amari's death, some of which were horrific, while others were simply infuriating. According to an affidavit, Deon told police that when he and Joseph picked the children up from daycare on Thursday, April 9, 2020, he thought Amari seemed subdued. After they got home, Deon stepped out for about 30 minutes to purchase food and diapers, and when he returned, Amari was already asleep. An affidavit written by Fort Worth Police Detective Christopher Parker said Joseph, reluctantly, told police that on the evening of April 9, 2020, Amari had wet his bed, so he placed the almost 4-year-old on the bathroom counter to change him. Why would he put a 3-year-old on the counter to change him instead of stripping him out of his wet pants while he stood on the floor? Joseph said he stepped out of the bathroom to retrieve wipes from the living room, and while he was gone, Amari fell off the bathroom counter and hit his head on the floor. Joseph told police that when he returned to the bathroom, Amari jumped back up and started talking. Joseph said nothing appeared to be wrong with Amari, other than a headache, and Amari watched TV until he fell asleep, at which point Joseph put him back into bed. The next morning, Joseph told police, he and Deon were preparing to get Amari and his baby brother ready for daycare when they found Amari unresponsive on the floor of his bedroom with the boy's playpen on top of him. Joseph said when he checked Amari's pulse, he heard gargled breathing and saw blood seeping from Amari's nose and ear. At that point, instead of calling 911 and summoning an ambulance like most logical, innocent caregivers would do, Joseph and Deon drove the unresponsive little boy to the hospital themselves. The affidavit also mentioned that Dion and Joseph arrived at the hospital with Amari about 48 minutes after they said they found him unresponsive, but that the drive from their apartment to the hospital should have taken at most 18 minutes. A doctor at Cook Children's told Detective Parker that falling from a bathroom counter could not have caused Amari's injuries, which were described as a massive skull fracture and massive brain injury and massive bleeding around the brain. When NBC News reporter Julia Ingram was able to track down and speak with Dion Foley over the summer, he told her that Amari's fatal injuries were incurred at daycare. That's a significantly different explanation than falling from a bathroom counter. The affidavits note that tests inside the apartment indicated a significant amount of blood had been cleaned up in the bathroom and in the boy's bedroom. Joseph told police that a few weeks prior, Amari ran face first into a door frame and got a bump on his eye, which resulted in a call to CPS. He also said that Amari liked jumping off his bed and had, as a result, hit his head numerous times. Dion, however, told police he had never seen Amari do that before. Dion said Amari was well-behaved and quiet and described Joseph as the disciplinarian of the family. Also noted were Google searches found on the defendant's devices, including how to keep your foster child, how to beat CPS, can I get food stamps for my foster child, how to get a new CPS caseworker, and how much does a foster parent make in Texas? Facebook messages between the pair revealed multiple conversations about injuries Amari had suffered and whether or not to report them to CPS. In their messages, the couple bickered about Joseph being too hard on Amari versus Dion not being strict enough. They also frequently discussed buying alcohol and marijuana. Amari was previously admitted to Cook Children's Hospital twice while in this catastrophic couple's care. On February 18, 2020, he was admitted with leg pain after allegedly tripping down the stairs. At one point, Joseph sent Dion a video via Facebook in which Amari was walking with a pronounced limp. Joseph captioned this video, "He moving a lot better today." The affidavit mentioned that it was later discovered that Amari's pelvis was fractured. It's unclear if that injury was discovered at the time of his admission or during his autopsy. While I'm on the subject, I might as well point out that pediatric pelvic fractures are extremely rare, only estimated to make up between 0.5 and 7% of all blunt pediatric traumas. They are most often caused by high-energy forces, such as car accidents, followed by falls from a significant height and sports injuries. No car accidents were reported by the defendants, nor were any falls from anything higher than a bathroom counter, and at age 3, Amari was not participating in any sports to speak of. This was clearly an inflicted injury. This part is alarming. Multiple reports were made through the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services statewide intake division, alleging abuse by Joseph and Dion. On March 7th, Rodney and Ariana, the boys' parents, reported that Joseph had been hitting Amari and mentioned bruises on his chest and back. It is unclear if it was the incident during which the parents sent multiple photos of Amari's injuries, including swollen eyes and a swollen lip, to the CPS caseworker. Then, on March 17th, an acquaintance of Joseph's reported that the couple was beating the boys and that Joseph had hurt Amari's lip. She said that Amari was afraid of Joseph and that he and Dion smoked marijuana and drank around the kids every day. According to the affidavit, the witness said that when she first met Amari, he was chatty, as opposed to the last time she saw him, when his face was swollen and he wouldn't speak. In February, the affidavit alleged, Joseph spanked Amari at least 5 times for wetting his pants. This little boy was 3 years old. CPS was aware of these multiple abuse allegations and took no action to remove Amari and his brother from this environment. Amari's brother was only removed from the home when Amari was fatally injured. Within days of Amari's death, Dion and Joseph had broken the lease on their apartment and disappeared. Both men have family and other ties in multiple states outside of Texas. Why, after demonstrating that they are clearly a flight risk, they were granted bond and allowed to walk free is beyond comprehension. This case screams injustice louder and louder with every detail uncovered. Those in charge have made promises, sworn they were working toward capital murder charges, and vowed to put together an airtight case. They've begged Team Amari to stand down in the past, and we've complied, giving them ample time to build their case without ratcheting up the pressure. Tarrant County Criminal District Attorney Sharon Wilson said in a statement, "The Fort Worth Police Department and the Tarrant County Criminal District Attorney's Office continue to work on this case together. seeking the best outcome for Amari Boone's family. We cannot comment on pending cases, but we all want the same thing: justice for Amari. The charges against these two men come nowhere near justice for Amari, and these two alleged child murderers walking the streets cannot be considered the best outcome for anyone. Rodney Boone met with prosecutors in January to discuss his concerns about the weakness of the charges against the defendants. He said it was a productive meeting, but it didn't change his mind. The two should be charged with murder. Rodney told NBC DFW, "They were the only people my son was with at the time of his death. It's not making sense." The Fort Worth Police Department said the investigation is ongoing and mentioned that the charges may be upgraded. Interesting, then, that prosecutor Bill Vassar said during the summer of 2020 that he refused to settle for lesser charges and wouldn't file a single charge until he was sure he could secure a capital murder conviction. I wonder what happened to that resolve. In April of 2021, I sent a petition organized by Light for the Missing and bearing well over 300,000 signatures demanding justice for Amari to Criminal District Attorney Sharon Wilson. Since the petition was delivered, neither I nor any other member of our grassroots Justice for Amari Boone group has heard a peep from Ms. Wilson. I wasn't able to find Joseph Delancey's case status no matter how many ways I entered his name into the Tarrant County court docket search. Dion Foley's next court date is an evidence exchange scheduled for November 2nd, 2021. In episode 13, I covered the case of 10-month-old Marion Jester-Montoya, the Lubbock, Texas baby who was allegedly murdered by her mother's boyfriend, Trevor Rowe, when he stuffed her into a backpack and left her in his car all day while he was at work. The beautiful, dark-haired baby with the chubby cheeks died on January 7, 2020, and Trevor was charged with capital murder. Trevor, who I will never stop calling Rat Boy, and you only need to look at his mugshot to figure out why, was the best friend of Marion's biological dad, Emilio Montoya. There hasn't been much movement to speak of in the legal case, at least nothing publicly visible, but from what I can tell, there appear to have been up to 46 pretrial motions entered on January 12th of this year. I was unable to find any information on what those motions might be or if there was any decision in the matter by Judge John Trey McClendon III. On March 10th, June 2nd, and August 4th of this year, the court docket shows that plea negotiation conference hearings were scheduled, but again, the outcome of those is unclear. In other terrible news related to Marion's case, her mother, Veronica Weems, birthed another baby in June of 2021. If the reason I'd consider that terrible news isn't clear, please give episode 13 a listen, and I guarantee you'll come out of it with the same opinion. We can only hope this baby has a fighting chance since Veronica is currently engaged to the baby's father. Finally, the Montoya family held a memorial on the 1-year anniversary of Marion's death, during which they, along with friends and supporters, gathered in Lubbock at the corner of 130th Street and Upland Avenue, the exact location where Marion died in Trevor's car. The group sang Marion's favorite songs while a table nearby displayed some of her toys and photos of the happy, chubby-cheeked, dark-eyed little beauty. Rat Boy Trevor Rowe is being held in the Lubbock County Detention Center on a bond of $2 million. If and when I learn anything more about the progress of the criminal case, I'll be sure to update the blog. Marion's family deserves justice already. I hoped to have time for more updates for you in this episode, but for the sake of time, my failing voice, and my own sanity, I'll end this one here. But I'll sprinkle these update episodes throughout the upcoming weeks just to get us all up to speed on some of the cases I've covered over the past 85 episodes. My sources for today's episode were the Daily Herald, the Associated Press, Pix 11, the Daily Mail, the New York Daily News, the New York Department of Corrections website, the West Virginia Register Herald, the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, VineLink, the Nevada Department of Corrections website, the Wichita County Jail website, Texoma's homepage, the Times Record News, the Wichita County Odyssey portal, the Justice for Amari Boone Facebook group, members of the Light for the Missing volunteer organization, the Tarrant County Jail website, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the Dallas Morning News, Tarrant County Court, Fox 4 News, NBC DFW, Everything Lubbock, KLBK News, Lubbock County Public Access, and Facebook. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes or become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook and Instagram. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. All music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. If you see something, say something. Until next week, bye everyone.